Lyanna felt the disturbance in the cosmic web 3 months before anyone else noticed, and she stood on her balcony overlooking the silver forests of Altheria, while her smallest dragon shadow whimpered against her leg, sensing the wrongness that rippled through space itself. She had been a dragon rider for 50 years, which was young by elf standards, but her bond with her 3 dragons gave her senses that extended far beyond what normal elves could perceive. And right now, those senses were screaming warnings that made her blood run cold ember. Her largest and oldest dragon lay coiled on the stone floor behind her, and his golden eyes tracked something in the distance that only he could see while his tail twitched with agitation. And Lyanna knew that whatever was coming would be unlike anything their peaceful world had ever faced. The morning council meeting was supposed to address trade agreements with the neighboring systems, but Lyanna stood up in the middle of Chancellor Mireth's speech about grain exports and announced that they needed to prepare for war immediately. The silence that followed her words was broken only by uncomfortable laughter from the younger council members who thought she was making some kind of joke because Altheria had not seen war in over 3,000 years, and the very concept seemed absurd to most of them. Chancellor Mireth fixed her with his cold stare and reminded her that dragon riders were meant to patrol borders and protect merchant vessels, not spread panic about imaginary threats, and several other council members nodded in agreement. While whispering behind their hands, Lyanna pulled out the data crystal that contained her dragon's sensory readings from the past week and projected it above the council table, showing the massive gravitational distortions forming at the edge of their system and moving closer with each passing day. The readings showed energy signatures unlike anything in their databases and the pattern-matched reports from other systems that had gone silent over the past year. But Chancellor Mireth dismissed it as cosmic background radiation and refused to authorize any defensive preparations. She left the council chamber feeling frustrated and afraid because she knew what was coming and she knew her people were not ready. And she knew that their ancient magic and ceremonial weapons would not be enough against whatever was approaching. That evening she flew to the outer observation post on the 6th moon where her friend Kellen worked as a sensor technician, and she asked him to show her the raw data feeds without any of the filters the council used to make. The readings seemed less threatening. Kellen was hesitant at first because sharing unfiltered data was technically against regulations, but he trusted Lyanna more than he trusted the politicians who kept insisting everything was fine, and he pulled up the real numbers on his private terminal. What Lyanna saw made her hands shake because the energy signatures were not cosmic radiation. They were engine emissions from hundreds of ships, and those ships were getting closer, and they would reach Altheria in less than 3 months. Kellen asked her what they should do, and she told him to start backing up all critical data and quietly spreading word to anyone he trusted that they might need to evacuate soon, and he promised to do so. Even though it could cost him his position, she flew back to the capital on embers, back with Frost and Shadow flanking them, and she spent the entire flight trying to figure out how to convince the council that the threat was real when they refused to believe anything that disrupted their comfortable worldview. The next day she requested a private meeting with High Commander Valen, who led the planetary defense forces, and she hoped that a military leader would be more willing to listen to tactical concerns than politicians worried about maintaining. Calm Valen listened to her evidence with a serious expression and asked pointed questions about the dragon's sensory capabilities and the timeline of the approaching fleet, and for a moment Lyanna thought she had finally found someone who understood. But then Valen sighed and explained that he believed her, but his hands were tied because the council controlled military funding, and they had already rejected his requests for updated weapons and shield generators, claiming the budget was needed elsewhere. He told her that the defense fleet consisted of 12 patrol ships designed for pirate interdiction, not actual warfare, and their planetary shields had not been tested in over a century and probably would not hold against sustained bombardment. Lyanna felt despair settling over her like a cold blanket, because if even the military commander knew they were unprepared but could not act, then her people were doomed, unless she could find another way. That night she sat in her private library surrounded by ancient texts and data cores searching for any information about civilizations that had faced similar invasions and survived, and most of the records she found ended with the words population extinct. But one file caught her attention because it mentioned a species called humans who lived on a planet designated as a death world and who had somehow turned their brutal environment into an advantage that made them formidable warriors. The file was old and incomplete, but it mentioned that humans had helped defend the Centauri colonies against raiders 5 years ago, and that their tactics were considered savage, but extremely effective. Liana pulled up the navigation charts and found that human space was only 4 days away, at maximum speed. But the problem was that elves and humans had never established formal relations because most elves considered humans to be dangerous primitives, best avoided. She spent 3 days gathering every piece of information about humans she could find, and what she learned was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. Because yes, humans were violent and aggressive, but they were also fiercely loyal to their allies and had a strange honor code about protecting weaker species. The decision she was considering would likely end her career and possibly get her exiled, because making first contact with humans without council approval was strictly forbidden and could be seen as treason. But Liana looked at her 3 dragons sleeping peacefully in the corner and thought about all the other elves going about their daily lives completely unaware that extinction was approaching, and she knew she had no choice. She began preparing her ship for a long journey and gathering supplies and programming the navigation coordinates for human space, and she told no one except Kellen, who promised to monitor the approaching fleet and send her updates. 2 weeks later, when the council was still debating whether to even acknowledge the sensor readings, Liana climbed into her ship with her 3 dragons and launched toward human territory, hoping that the savage Deathworlders would be willing to help people who had always looked down on them. The journey through the void gave her too much time to think about all the ways this could go wrong, because humans might refuse to help, or worse, they might see Altheria as easy prey once they learned about the approaching invasion. But she kept flying, because doing nothing was not an option, and watching her people die without even trying to save them was unacceptable. And if the humans turned out to be monsters, then at least she would know she tried. On the 4th day, her sensors detected human patrol ships, and she sent out the diplomatic code she had found in the old files and waited with her heart pounding to see if they would shoot first and ask questions later. A human voice came through her communication system, asking her to identify herself and state her business, and she took a deep breath and began explaining that her world was about to be invaded, and she needed to speak with whoever commanded their military forces. There was a long pause, and then the human told her to follow their escort ships to the nearest military station, and she felt a tiny spark of hope because they had not immediately refused or attacked. Liana followed the human ships through a series of defensive positions that impressed her with their strategic placement, and she realized these Deathworlders understood warfare in a way her people had forgotten. The military station was massive and bristling with weapons, and when she docked, she was met by officers who looked at her dragons with fascination rather than fear, and she knew that perhaps the humans were exactly what her people needed. The human military station smelled wrong to Liana, because it carried scents of metal and fuel and something sharp that made her nose wrinkle while her dragons shifted nervously behind her, trying to process this alien environment. Commander Hayes met her in the docking bay, and he was younger than she expected, with dark hair and steady eyes that assessed her and her dragons with the calculating gaze of someone who understood both danger and opportunity. He spoke in clear trade language and welcomed her to Station Olympus and gestured for her to follow him through corridors that hummed with power and purpose, while armed soldiers watched her pass with expressions that mixed curiosity with professional alertness. Liana noticed that the humans moved differently than elves because they had a compact efficiency to their movements that came from living on a world with higher gravity. And she realized these people were physically stronger than her species. Hayes led her to a briefing room where several other officers waited, and he offered her a chair that was too low for her tall frame, but she sat anyway while her dragons arranged themselves around her feet. The humans asked her questions about the approaching fleet, and she showed them the data Kellen had been sending her, and watched their faces grow serious as they analyzed the energy signatures and projected arrival times. A woman named Captain Ford pulled up comparison data on her display and explained that the signatures matched a species called the Krathel, who were known raiders that had destroyed multiple civilizations in the past decade. Hayes asked Leanna why her government had not requested help through official channels, and she felt shame as she admitted that her council refused to believe the threat was real and would never approve asking humans for assistance. The human officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes, and Hayes finally said that they had been tracking the Krathul fleet for weeks and had been planning an intercept mission, but were waiting for the right tactical opportunity. Ford explained that the Krathul always targeted isolated worlds that lacked strong allies, and that their strategy relied on overwhelming force before anyone could respond, and that hitting them while they were engaged with another target could work to humanity's advantage. Leanna felt cold anger building because she realized the humans had known about the threat to her world and had been planning to use it as bait. But Hayes must have seen her expression because he quickly clarified their position. He told her that they had tried to warn the Elven Council through diplomatic channels 2 months ago, but their message had been rejected as human interference, and that without an official request for help, they could not legally enter Elven space. The truth was complicated because apparently the Krathul had diplomatic immunity in several sectors due to old treaties, and attacking them without cause would start a larger war that humanity was not ready to fight. But if the Krathul attacked Altheria first, then humanity would have legal justification to engage them and possibly convince other species to join a coalition against future raids. Leanna understood the logic, but hated that politics prevented immediate action while her people remained in danger, and she asked Hayes directly if humanity would help when the invasion began. Hayes stood and walked to the window overlooking space, and he was quiet for a long moment before he turned back and told her that humanity had a saying about how evil triumphs when good people do nothing. He explained that humans had almost destroyed themselves in their own world wars before, learning to work together, and that experience taught them the value of protecting others, even when it was not convenient or profitable. Ford added that humanity was tired of watching the Krathul destroy civilizations, while bureaucrats argued about jurisdiction and that sometimes you had to break a few rules to do the right thing. Hayes asked Leanna detailed questions about Altheria's defenses and population centers and evacuation capabilities, and she answered as honestly as she could, even when the truth revealed how unprepared her people were. The human officers worked through the night creating battle plans and running simulations, and Leanna watched in fascination as they coordinated their strategy with a precision her people had never needed because they had never faced real war. Morning came, and Hayes called Leanna to his office and showed her a plan that involved the human defense fleet positioning itself just outside Elven space, ready to jump in the moment the Krathul attacked. He explained that they could not prevent the first strike because they needed legal justification, but they would minimize casualties by being ready to respond within minutes rather than hours or days. Leanna asked what she should do, and Hayes told her to return home and convince as many people as possible to move into deep shelters when the time came, because the initial bombardment would be devastating. He also gave her a specialized communication crystal that would connect directly to his ship and bypass normal channels so she could alert him the instant the Krathul arrived. Ford pulled her aside and taught her the basics of human tactical communication, because the humans used direct language and specific terminology that differed from Elven diplomatic speech patterns. She also explained that in battle humans valued speed over elegance and results over protocol, and that Leanna should not be offended if orders seemed harsh, because that was just how warriors communicated. Under stress, Leanna spent 2 more days on the station learning about human weapons and tactics and watching their training exercises, and she was struck by how seriously they took combat preparation. The human soldiers practiced constantly, and they pushed themselves to exhaustion and beyond because they knew that hesitation in battle meant death, and they trained their reflexes until responses became automatic. One young soldier named Private Chen asked if he could meet her dragons, and Leanna agreed because she wanted to see how the creatures would react to humans. Ember approached Chen cautiously and sniffed him thoroughly, while the soldier stood perfectly still, and then the dragon made a sound that Leanna had never heard before, which was almost like approval. Chen carefully reached out and touched Ember's scales and grinned with pure joy, and told Leanna that dragons were the most amazing thing he had ever seen. And could they really breathe fire? Leanna demonstrated by having Frost create a small flame, and the humans who had gathered to watch actually applauded, and several asked questions about dragon biology and bonding. She realized that humans did not fear dragons. They respected them as fellow predators, and that perspective was completely different from how other species typically reacted. Hayes found her later and said that his superiors had approved the mission, and the fleet would be ready to move in 24 hours, and that Lyanna should return home immediately. She thanked him with formal elven words, but he waved them away and told her that thanks were premature, because the real test would come when the fighting started. Before she left, Ford gave her a crash course in emergency battlefield medicine, because Hayes wanted her able to help survivors after the initial attack. The journey back to Altheria felt faster than the journey out, because now, Lyanna knew that help was coming, even if her own people still refused to prepare properly. When she arrived home, Kellen contacted her immediately with urgent news because the Krathul fleet had suddenly accelerated and would arrive in less than 2 weeks instead of the projected 4. Lyanna sent the update to Hayes, who responded that his fleet was already moving into position and that she should start getting people into shelters, using whatever excuse she could invent. She went to the council one final time and begged them to order evacuations, but Chancellor Mireth accused her of collaborating with humans and threatened to have her arrested for treason. Valen pulled her aside afterward and told her quietly that he believed her, and that he was positioning what few defense forces they had as best he could without official authorization. Lyanna spent the next 10 days flying across Altheria, warning anyone who would listen and helping families move into the old mountain bunkers that had been built during the ancient wars. Many people ignored her, but some remembered the old stories and saw the fear in her eyes and decided that caution was better than pride. She made sure her own family was safe in the deepest shelter and said goodbye to her younger brother, knowing she might not see him again. On the 13th day, the sky began to darken as the Krathul fleet emerged from their dimensional jump, and Lyanna stood on her tower watching death approach while her dragons roared their defiance at the stars. She activated the crystal Hayes had given her and spoke the words that would either save her world or doom it, and then she waited to see if the humans would keep their promise. The Krathul fleet filled the sky above Altheria like a swarm of metal locusts, and Lyanna counted over 300 ships, ranging from small fighters to massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed anything her people had ever constructed. Her communication crystal flared with Hayes's voice cutting through the static and asking for exact positions of the enemy command ships, and she relayed everything her dragon's enhanced senses could detect. The first Krathul bombardment struck the outer defense stations, and they exploded like paper lanterns in a storm. Because the elven shields were designed to stop pirates, not military-grade weapons, Lyanna watched helplessly as the defense fleet tried to engage, but their weapons barely scratched the Krathul armor, and within minutes 6 of the 12 elven ships were destroyed or disabled. Chancellor Mireth's voice came through the emergency network, ordering all civilians to remain calm and insisting that diplomatic channels were being opened, but Lyanna knew it was far too late for diplomacy. A Krathul flagship broadcast a message in cold mechanical tones, demanding complete surrender within 1 hour or they would begin destroying population centers, and Lyanna felt sick because she knew these monsters never honored surrender terms. Hayes contacted her again and told her that the human fleet was jumping in, but they needed her to keep transmitting target data, because the Krathul were using some kind of interference field that was blocking long-range sensors. She climbed onto Ember's back and launched from her tower with Frost and Shadow following close behind, and she flew high above the city where her dragon's senses could cut through the interference below her. The capital city was descending into chaos as people finally understood that the threat was real, and they ran for shelters that were not designed to hold so many, while air raid sirens screamed warnings that came too late. The Krathul began their systematic destruction of military targets, and orbital platforms exploded in brilliant flashes while debris rained down through the atmosphere, leaving burning trails across the sky. Valen's remaining ships tried to form a defensive perimeter around the capital, but they were hopelessly outnumbered, and Lyanna watched one brave captain deliberately ram his damaged vessel into a Krathul cruiser, buying precious seconds for civilians below. The enemy ships started moving into bombardment formation above the northern continent, and Lyanna knew they were preparing to glass entire cities, and she screamed into her crystal asking Hayes where the human fleet was. Space itself seemed to tear open as 12 massive human warships emerged from their dimensional jump, and they were positioned perfectly between the Krathul fleet and Altheria in a defensive formation that spoke of careful planning. The lead ship, which Hayes called the Valkyrie, was larger than 3 Krathul dreadnoughts combined, and it bristled with weapons that looked like they could crack planets. Hayes's voice came through steady and calm, telling her to get every remaining civilian underground immediately, because the humans were about to demonstrate why other species called them Deathworlders. The Valkyrie opened fire, and the void itself seemed to scream as magnetic accelerator cannons launched projectiles at relativistic speeds, and 3 Krathul cruisers simply ceased to exist, vaporized by impacts that released more energy than nuclear weapons. The other human ships spread into an attack pattern, and their point defense systems created walls of light that intercepted every Krathul missile before they could reach their targets. Lyanna had never seen anything like it, because the humans fought with a precision and brutality that came from centuries of warfare. On their brutal homeworld, where only the strong survived, the Krathul fleet tried to regroup and focus fire on the Valkyrie, but human ships moved with impossible agility, for their size and their shields held against weapons that had destroyed elven defenses in seconds. Ford's voice cut into the command channel, ordering fighter wings to engage, and suddenly space filled with smaller human craft that swarmed the Krathul ships like angry hornets. The human fighters were faster and more maneuverable than anything the Krathul had, and their pilots flew with a reckless courage that bordered on insanity, diving through enemy fire to strike weak points. A Krathul dreadnought tried to break through toward the planet's surface, and the Valkyrie moved to intercept, firing its main cannon at point-blank range, and the enemy ship broke in half from the impact. But the Krathul were not defeated yet, and they had numbers on their side, and they began coordinating their attacks, forcing the human ships to spread their defenses thinner. Hayes contacted Lyanna with a request that sounded insane, because he wanted her to fly into the enemy flagship and disable its shield generator from inside, while his ships kept the rest of the fleet busy. Every instinct told her it was suicide, but she looked down at her burning world and knew that desperate times required desperate actions, and the humans were already risking everything to save people they barely knew. She told Hayes she would do it, and he transmitted coordinates for the flagship's intake ports, along with a schematic showing the fastest route to the shield generator. Ford came on the line and gave her rapid-fire instructions about what the generator would look like and exactly where to strike it to cause a cascade. Failure! Lyanna guided her 3 dragons into a steep dive toward the Krathul flagship, and human fighters formed an escort around her, drawing fire and clearing a path through the debris field. Plasma bolts tore through the space around them, and Frost screamed as one shot grazed her wing, but she kept flying because dragon pride would not allow her to fall. The intake port loomed ahead, and Lyanna whispered prayers to the old gods as Ember folded his wings and shot through the narrow opening, with Shadow and Frost following close behind. Inside the ship was chaos, because alarms were blaring and Krathul soldiers were running through corridors, trying to respond to the human attack outside. The first soldier they encountered raised a weapon, but Ember bathed him in dragon fire before he could shoot, and the smell of burning flesh filled the corridor. Lyanna had memorized the schematic, and she guided her dragons through the maze of passages toward the shield generator, while more soldiers appeared and opened. Fire Shadow wrapped around one soldier and crushed him, while Frost used her tail to knock another into a wall hard enough that his armor cracked. They reached a sealed door, and Ember used his fire breath to melt through the locking mechanism, while Lyanna watched their backs and used her magic to deflect incoming shots. The door opened, and they burst into the generator room, which was massive and filled with pulsing energy cores that hummed with barely contained power. Krathul technicians tried to stop them, but Lyanna had no mercy left, and she channeled every ounce of her magic into a focused strike that shattered the main control crystal. The generators began to overload, and emergency lighting turned everything red, while a mechanical voice announced in the Krathul language that catastrophic failure was imminent. Hayes's voice screamed through her crystal, telling her to get out now, because the Valkyrie was preparing to fire, and she did not want to be inside the target. The escape was pure chaos, because the flagship was tearing itself apart, and explosions rocked the corridors, while Krathul crew members abandoned their posts and ran for escape pods. Lyanna felt Ember's exhaustion through their bond, but the brave dragon pushed himself harder than ever before, because he would not let his rider die in this metal tomb. They burst out of the intake port just as the flagship's shields completely failed, and the Valkyrie fired Its main weapon and the massive Krathul ship broke apart in a fireball that lit up half the planet. The remaining Krathul ships immediately began retreating because their command structure was destroyed and humans were hunting them with terrifying efficiency. Lyanna guided her exhausted dragons down toward the capital landing platform where Hayes had transmitted coordinates and she could barely feel her hands because adrenaline was wearing off. The city below was damaged but standing, and she could see people emerging from shelters and staring up at the human ships that had saved them from extinction when she landed. Hayes was waiting, and he looked tired but satisfied, and he offered his hand in the human gesture of respect. Lyanna took his hand and thanked him with words that felt inadequate because how do you thank someone for saving your entire species? Hayes smiled and told her that humans had a saying about how the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Around them, other human ships were landing and soldiers were helping with rescue operations, and Lyanna realized that the Deathworlders were not monsters. They were the most honorable warriors she had ever met. The war was not over, because the Krathul would return eventually, but today, her people had survived and they had learned an important lesson about pride and prejudice and asking for help. The first 3 days after the battle felt like walking through a nightmare that refused to end, because everywhere Lyanna looked, she saw destruction and death and the faces of people who had lost everything. Her dragons were exhausted and wounded, with Frost suffering the worst injuries from the plasma burn that had scorched her wing. But human medics worked alongside elven healers, treating even the animals with care and respect. Hayes had established a command center in what remained of the planetary defense headquarters, and Lyanna found herself working beside him, coordinating rescue operations and helping survivors find missing family members. The human soldiers moved through the ruined cities with efficiency that came from too much experience with disaster relief, and they pulled people from collapsed buildings and distributed food and medical supplies without waiting for thanks. Chancellor Mareth finally emerged from his bunker on the second day and immediately tried to reassert authority by demanding that the humans leave elven space now that the immediate threat had passed. Lyanna watched Hayes' face remain perfectly neutral as he listened to the Chancellor's speech about sovereignty and proper diplomatic channels. But she could see the anger in his eyes. Ford stepped forward and calmly informed Mirith that the Krathul were regrouping in the next system and would likely return within a week, and that human forces would remain until Altheria could defend itself. The Chancellor turned red and began to argue, but Valen, who had survived the battle with only minor injuries, interrupted and pointed out that without human help, every elf on the planet would be dead. The argument that followed revealed deep divisions in elven leadership, because some council members agreed with Mirith that accepting human help showed weakness, while others understood that pride was worthless if you were extinct. Lyanna stood and spoke with a voice that cut through the debate, and she told the council that she had seen humans sacrifice themselves to protect people who had always looked down on them with contempt. She described watching human fighter pilots deliberately draw fire away from civilian areas knowing they would die, and she asked the council what they had done during the battle besides hide underground. The silence that followed was broken only by Mireth sputtering about protocol, but several younger council members were nodding and looking ashamed. Hayes ended the meeting by stating that human forces would remain for 1 week to help with reconstruction and defense, and after that Altheria would need to make decisions about its future. That evening, Lyanna found Hayes on the roof of the command center, staring at the stars, and she thanked him again for everything humanity had done. He told her that thanks were not necessary, because humans understood what it meant to be underestimated and dismissed, and sometimes the best way to prove your worth was to help others see theirs. They talked about their different worlds, and Lyanna learned that Earth was indeed as harsh as the stories claimed, with extreme weather and dangerous predators and diseases that would kill most species. Hayes explained that humans evolved to be adaptable and stubborn because their planet gave them no choice, and that same stubbornness made them refuse to watch other species suffer when they could help. Lyanna asked why humans had been so ready to fight the Krathul when it was not their battle, and Hayes was quiet for a moment before answering. He told her about humanity's own history of war and genocide and how they had almost destroyed themselves before finally learning that violence should be used to protect, not conquer. Ford joined them, and added that humans had a cultural memory of being the underdog fighting against overwhelming odds, and that made them sympathetic to other species facing extinction. Over the next few days, Lyanna worked closely with the human military, learning about their technology and tactics, and she was amazed by how much they were willing to teach. Captain Ford took her to one of the human ships and showed her their weapons systems and explained that the magnetic accelerators used no explosives, just pure kinetic energy. She also learned about human shield technology, which was different from elven energy barriers, because it used layered fields that could absorb and redirect multiple types of attacks. The human soldiers were friendly and curious about elven culture, and several asked if they could learn magic, which made Lyanna laugh because magic was something you were born with, not learned. But when she explained that magic was really just manipulating natural energy fields using mental focus, one engineer got excited and started talking about quantum mechanics and probability manipulation. Lyanna realized that humans and elves were not so different because both species tried to understand and control the universe. They just used different tools and terminology. On the 5th day, Kellen came to her with news from the outer sensors, and the readings showed that the Krathul fleet was indeed regrouping and had been reinforced with ships from other sectors. Hayes called an emergency meeting and explained that the Krathul were preparing for a second attack, and this time they would come with overwhelming force intended to crush any resistance. Valine asked if the human fleet could hold against such numbers, and Hayes admitted that they could delay the enemy, but would eventually be overwhelmed without reinforcements. Ford suggested that this was an opportunity to form a proper alliance, because if Altheria and humanity worked together, they could convince other systems to join a defensive coalition. Myrith immediately objected, claiming that formal alliances required years of negotiation and cultural exchange. But Lyanna stood and said they did not have years. They had days. She proposed that Altheria grant humanity a permanent military base on the 6th moon, and in exchange human forces would help modernize elven defenses and train their soldiers. The council erupted in argument with traditionalists, insisting this would mean losing their independence, while pragmatists pointed out that independence meant nothing if they were all dead. Lyanna turned to Hayes and asked him directly if humanity would accept such an arrangement, and he said that humans would be honored to stand beside the elves as equals and allies. The vote was close but eventually passed because even the most stubborn council members could not ignore the reality of what was coming. Over the next 2 days, construction crews from both species worked around the clock building the base on the 6th moon, and it was the first joint project between their civilizations. Lyanna spent time with her dragons, helping them heal, and she noticed that Ember seemed particularly interested in the human ships and kept trying to fly close to them. Hayes explained that dragons probably sensed the power in the human reactors and were curious about something that produced so much energy without being alive. On the 7th day, the Krathul returned with twice as many ships as before, but this time they found Altheria defended by not just 12 human vessels, but by a combined fleet. The Elven Defense Force had been reorganized and equipped with weapons that human engineers had helped them build in just 1 week using techniques that combined technology and magic. Lyanna flew with her dragons alongside human fighter wings, and she marveled at how well they coordinated, because days of training together had created genuine trust. The battle was fierce and lasted for hours, but the combined fleet held the line, and eventually the Krathul were forced to retreat after losing over half their ships. When the fighting ended, Hayes contacted other human commanders in the region, and within hours, ships from 3 more species arrived asking about joining the defensive alliance. Lyanna realized that the humans had been planning this all along, because they knew that one dramatic victory would convince others that standing against the Krathul was possible. Ford admitted later that humans had learned through bitter experience that building alliances required showing what you stood for, not just talking about it. The new coalition held meetings on the 6th moon base, and representatives from 7 different species worked together to create a unified defense strategy. Lyanna found herself serving as a liaison between the elves and humans, because she understood both cultures and could translate not just language, but intentions. Chancellor Myrith was forced to resign after it became clear that most elves no longer trusted his judgment, and the new chancellor was a younger elf named Theron, who had fought in the battle. Theron's first act was to formally apologize to humanity for decades of prejudice and to propose a cultural exchange program so the two species could learn from each other. Hayes accepted graciously and suggested that some young elves might want to attend human military academies, while human scholars could study. Elven magic Lyanna volunteered to be part of the first exchange group, and she spent the next 6 months on Earth learning about human warfare and teaching humans about dragon bonding. Earth was everything the stories claimed: harsh and beautiful, and deadly. But Lyanna grew to love it because she saw how it shaped humans into people who valued strength, but also compassion. When she returned to Altheria, she brought with her new ideas about combining magic and technology, and she worked with engineers from both species to create hybrid defense systems. Her dragons had bonded with several human pilots, and Ember particularly liked a young pilot named Lieutenant Baker, who treated him with proper respect. The alliance grew stronger, and within a year the Krathul stopped raiding systems under Coalition protection, because they had learned that attacking these worlds meant facing unified resistance. 2 years after the first Krathul attack, Lyanna stood on the observation deck of the new Coalition headquarters, watching ships from 15 different species conduct joint training exercises in the space above Altheria. Her dragons were fully healed, and stronger than ever, with Frost's wing showing only a faint scar from the plasma burn that had nearly killed her. During that desperate flight through the Krathul flagship, Hayes had been promoted to Admiral, and now commanded the entire Coalition defense fleet. But he still made time to meet with Lyanna every week to discuss strategy and share stories about their very different childhoods. The cultural exchange program had exceeded everyone's expectations because young elves were learning human tactics, while human engineers were discovering that combining magic with technology created possibilities neither species had imagined alone. Lyanna now commanded a special unit that mixed dragon riders with human pilots, and their combined forces could strike hard and fast against any threat to Coalition space. The Krathul had tested the Alliance 3 more times over the past 2 years, but each attack was repelled with fewer losses because the defenders grew more coordinated. With every battle, Chancellor Theron had proven to be an excellent leader, who understood that strength came from unity, not isolation, and he had worked tirelessly to repair the damage that centuries of elven arrogance had caused. The 6th moon base had grown into a proper city where humans and elves lived and worked together, and children from both species played in parks that mixed earth plants with Altherian trees. Lyanna's younger brother had joined the Coalition Academy and was studying xenobiology because he wanted to understand the bonds between humans and other species. Ford had become the head of Coalition intelligence, and she had uncovered evidence that the Krathul were actually being supplied and directed by a much larger threat lurking in the unexplored regions beyond known space. The discovery had been disturbing but also galvanizing because it gave the Coalition a clear purpose and convinced even the most reluctant species to contribute ships and resources. Lyanna had traveled to Earth 3 more times, and each visit taught her new things about human resilience and creativity, and the strange way they turned every obstacle into an opportunity. She had climbed mountains with human soldiers and swam in Earth's oceans, and even attended a human wedding, where she learned that humans celebrated love with as much passion as they fought wars. Ember had actually bonded with Lieutenant Baker in a way that surprised everyone because dragons typically only bonded with elves, but apparently the dragon recognized a kindred spirit in the brave pilot. The two of them flew together regularly, and Baker had learned to use simple magic to enhance his communication with Ember, creating a partnership that was unprecedented in elven history. Frost and Shadow had also formed connections with human crew members, and Lyanna realized that dragons responded to courage and loyalty, regardless of species. The Coalition had begun exploring the outer regions, trying to find the source of the Krathul threat before it could launch a coordinated attack on all member worlds. Lyanna led several reconnaissance missions into dangerous territory, and she flew alongside human scouts who treated her as an equal rather than a curiosity. On one mission, they discovered an abandoned Krathul base, and inside they found evidence of experiments that made even hardened warriors feel sick. Because the Krathul had been trying to create biological weapons, Hayes ordered the base destroyed and every record of the experiment secured because some knowledge was too dangerous to let fall into the wrong hands. The discovery accelerated weapons development across the Coalition because everyone understood that the next major conflict would determine the survival of multiple civilizations. Human scientists worked with elven mages to create shields that could withstand biological attacks and weapons that could sterilize contaminated areas without harming the environment. Liana found herself spending more time in laboratories than on battlefields because her unique perspective as both warrior and dragon rider made her valuable in developing new tactics. She had changed so much from the desperate young elf who had begged humans for help, and she sometimes wondered if her younger self would recognize the confident coalition officer she had become. The answer was complicated because, while she had grown stronger and wiser, she had also learned to value things beyond elven traditions like human humor and their strange custom of sharing meals with comrades. Hayes told her once that she had become a bridge between species and that her willingness to learn from humans had inspired others to look beyond their prejudices. Ford added that Liana's bravery during the first battle had become legendary across the coalition because recordings of her flight into the Krathul flagship were used in training programs. Young recruits from multiple species studied her tactics, and many aspiring warriors asked to meet her, which felt strange because Liana still thought of herself as just someone who did what was necessary. The Coalition Council asked her to speak at the second anniversary ceremony of the Alliance, and she spent weeks preparing remarks that would honor both those who died and those who fought to build something better. Standing before representatives from 15 species, Liana talked about fear and courage, and the moment she realized that asking for help was not weakness but wisdom. She described watching human ships tear through space to defend people who had treated them with contempt, and she challenged everyone to live up to that example of selfless service. The speech was translated into dozens of languages and broadcast across coalition space, and Liana received messages from beings she had never met, thanking her for inspiring them. But the most meaningful response came from Hayes, who simply told her that humans were proud to call the elves their friends and that together they would face whatever challenges came. The third year brought new threats because the mysterious force behind the Krathul finally revealed itself as an ancient machine intelligence that saw organic life as a problem to be eliminated. The revelation united the coalition like nothing else could because every species understood that this was an existential threat that required total commitment to defeat. Liana volunteered to lead the first strike team into enemy territory, and Hayes approved her mission because he trusted her judgment and knew that dragon riders could go places regular ships could not. The mission was dangerous, and several times Liana thought they would not survive, but her team discovered the central processing hub that controlled the machine fleet. Working with human demolition experts, they planted charges that would cascade through the entire network, and they barely escaped before the explosion tore the hub apart. The victory was significant but not final because the machine intelligence had backup systems scattered across dozens of worlds, and destroying them all would take years. But the coalition had proven it could strike back, and that knowledge changed everything because species that had been considering surrender instead began preparing for a long war. Liana returned home to find that she had been promoted to general and given command of all special operations forces across the coalition. Hayes congratulated her and joked that humans had created a monster by teaching elves how to fight, because now the galaxy would never be safe from determined dragon riders. She laughed and reminded him that humans had started this by refusing to let the Krathul destroy Altheria, and that everything since then was just the logical consequence. Looking back at everything that had changed, Liana felt grateful for the fear that had driven her to seek help from strangers, because that desperate choice had saved not just her world but created something greater. The alliance was not perfect, and there were still cultural misunderstandings and political disagreements, but the bonds forged in battle had proven stronger than ancient prejudices. Her dragons had become symbols of the coalition because they represented the possibility of different species working together, and several worlds had requested dragon eggs to start their own rider programs. Liana had helped establish training centers where riders from multiple species learned together, and she was amazed at how quickly younglings bonded with dragons when they approached with respect and courage. The future was uncertain because the machine threat was real and growing, but Liana faced it without the crushing fear she had felt 3 years ago. She had learned that no species could survive alone, and that the strongest defense was friendship, and that sometimes the best thing you could do was admit you needed help. Hayes had taught her that strength was not about never falling, but about getting up every time you were knocked down and bringing others up with you. Ford had shown her that intelligence and careful planning could multiply the effectiveness of courage, and that knowing your enemy was as important as having powerful weapons. Most importantly, Liana had learned that the humans she once feared as savage Deathworlders were actually the best friends anyone could hope for in a dangerous galaxy. She stood on her tower one evening watching the sun set over the rebuilt capital city, and her 3 dragons arranged themselves around her as they had years ago. But this time she was not alone because human pilots were landing on nearby platforms and elven warriors, who had trained on Earth, were gathering for a mission briefing.